In the harsh mountains of 1880s Colorado, where survival depends on silence and minding your own business, everyone knows to avoid Cassandra McKenna. The mountain woman lives alone in a cabin above Bitter Creek, trades furs for supplies, and speaks to no one unless absolutely necessary. Her reputation keeps even the roughest men at a respectful distance. But when drunken Silas Garrett raises his hand to strike a trembling 12-year-old girl outside Murphy's Saloon, something snaps inside Cass. Her voice cuts through the mountain air like a blade. "Touch her again, and you'll die." In that moment, the solitary woman who has spent 15 years avoiding human connection throws herself between a brutal man and a defenseless child. What happens next will split the town in two and force everyone to choose between the safety of silence and the courage to protect the innocent. But what dark secret drives a woman to risk everything for a stranger's child? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like old ghosts as Cassandra McKenna emerged from her cabin, the wooden cross hidden beneath her shirt pressing against her collarbone. 15 years she'd worn it. 15 years since she'd stopped believing in the God it represented. Yet she couldn't bring herself to remove this last connection to who she used to be. Her boots crunched on frost-covered pine needles as she made her way down the narrow trail toward Bitter Creek settlement. The town below looked smaller from this height, its problems more manageable, its people reduced to moving specks in the distance. This perspective had served her well through the years of self-imposed exile. The trading post sat at the edge of town like a weathered sentinel, its wooden walls blackened by wood smoke and mountain weather. Murphy's Trading Post, the faded sign declared, though everyone simply called it Murphy's. Inside, the familiar scents of leather, tobacco, and bacon grease wrapped around her like an unwelcome embrace. "Morning, Cass," Murphy nodded from behind his counter, his Irish accent still thick after 20 years in Colorado territory. A stocky man with graying whiskers, he was one of the few who didn't flinch when she entered his establishment. She set her bundle of winter pelts on the scarred wooden counter. 3 fox, 2 rabbit, 1 deer hide. Properly cured, Murphy examined her work with practiced eyes, running his fingers along the soft fur. Her reputation for quality preceded her, and he never bothered to haggle. "Fine work as always. The usual supplies? Coffee, flour, salt. Add some hard candy if you have it." Murphy raised an eyebrow. Cass McKenna had never purchased candy in all their years of trading. "Special occasion?" She didn't answer, but something in her expression had shifted since yesterday's incident. Murphy had heard about the confrontation with Silas Garrett, had seen the bruises on young Sarah's face when the girl came begging for scraps behind his store. The whole town was talking, though most in whispers. "That girl," Murphy said carefully, "Sarah, she's been sleeping in the church vestry since her mother passed. Preacher Samuel's been looking the other way, but Silas found out yesterday." Cass's jaw tightened. "Not my concern." "Course not," Murphy agreed, but he wrapped the hard candy anyway. "Doc Harrison was asking about you this morning. Seems Silas took quite a knock to his pride yesterday. Been drinking heavy and talking loud about mountain women who don't know their place." The trading post door chimed as Sheriff Williams entered, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. A tall man with a carefully groomed mustache, he carried himself with the authority of someone who'd maintained order in rougher places than Bitter Creek. "Miss McKenna," he nodded. "Heard there was some excitement yesterday." "Nothing that concerns the law," Cass replied, shouldering her pack of supplies. "Maybe not yesterday. But Silas filed a complaint this morning. Says you threatened to kill him in front of witnesses. Did he mention what provoked that threat?" Sheriff Williams sighed. "He did not. But I've got eyes, Miss McKenna. I've seen that girl's bruises. Problem is, Silas is her legal guardian since her mother died. The law's clear on a man's right to discipline his ward, and if that discipline turns to murder, then I'll arrest him. But until then, my hands are tied." Cass studied the sheriff's face, seeing the frustration there. Williams was a decent man caught between bad law and moral necessity. She'd known men like him before, back when she believed the system could protect the innocent. "I understand your position, Sheriff. I hope you understand mine." She pushed past him toward the door, but Williams caught her arm gently. "Cass, I'm not your enemy here. But if you take the law into your own hands, I'll have no choice but to act. The law." The words came out like a curse. "Tell me, Sheriff, what did the law do for my husband and daughter?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Williams released her arm, his face troubled. Everyone in Bitter Creek knew that Cassandra McKenna had arrived 15 years ago, with nothing but the clothes on her back and grief carved into her features. No one knew what she'd fled from, but the pain in her eyes warned against asking. Outside, the mountain air bit at her cheeks as she loaded her supplies onto the mule she'd left tethered to the hitching post. The town moved around her with its familiar rhythms, women hanging laundry, men heading to the mines, children playing in the dusty streets. She caught sight of young Sarah sitting on the church steps, thin shoulders hunched against the cold. The girl looked up as Cass passed, hope flickering in her dark eyes before quickly being extinguished. Too many adults had failed her already. Cass reached into her pack and pulled out the hard candy, placing it in the girl's palm without a word. Sarah stared at the small gift as if it were made of gold. "Thank you," the girl whispered. Cass nodded once and continued up the mountain trail, the wooden cross burning against her chest like a brand. Behind her, the town settled into its patterns of willful blindness. And somewhere in Murphy's saloon, Silas Garrett nursed his wounded pride with whiskey and plans for revenge. Sarah Whitmore clutched the torn lace handkerchief against her chest as she huddled in the church vestry. The delicate fabric, one of the few things that still carried her mother's scent. The handkerchief had once been white, edged with intricate lacework that spoke of better times. But now it bore the stains of tears and the grime of a child with no one to care for her appearance. Her mother had been beautiful once, before the fever took hold, before the coughing fits that brought up blood, before the long nights when Sarah held cool cloths to her burning forehead and whispered prayers that went unanswered. Elizabeth Whitmore had possessed the refined manners of an Eastern lady, though she'd never spoken of her past or why she'd come west with nothing but a baby daughter and secrets. "Promise me, Sarah," her mother had whispered in those final days. "Promise me you'll be strong. You're smarter than most folks give you credit for. Use that mind of yours." Sarah had promised, though at 12 years old, she wasn't sure what strength looked like when you had nowhere to go and no one to protect you. Her mother had died believing that Silas Garrett was her brother, taken in by his lies and desperate enough to trust the only person who claimed kinship. Elizabeth had never known the truth about the man she'd entrusted with her daughter's future. The church bells chimed 6 times, marking another hour until Preacher Samuel would arrive for evening prayers. Sarah had learned his schedule by heart during the 3 weeks she'd been sleeping in the vestry, surviving on scraps from Murphy's kitchen and the occasional kindness of townswomen who turned blind eyes to Silas's cruelty. She pulled out the small primer book she'd salvaged from their old room above the seamstress shop, its pages worn soft from countless readings. Her mother had taught her letters and numbers, insisting that education was the one thing no one could take away. "A woman with learning has choices," Elizabeth used to say. "Remember that, my darling girl." Sarah could read better than most adults in Bitter Creek, though she kept this skill hidden. People grew suspicious of children who seemed too clever, and Silas had already warned her about putting on airs. The book contained simple stories about good children who minded their elders and found happiness through obedience. Sarah had learned not to trust such tales. The vestry door creaked open, and Sarah's heart hammered as heavy boots echoed on the wooden floor. She quickly hid the book beneath a pile of altar cloths, praying it wasn't Silas come to drag her back to his cabin for another night of drunken rage. "Child?" Preacher Samuel's gentle voice brought relief flooding through her small frame. "Are you well?" The preacher was a thin man, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. the sort of person who genuinely believed that faith could heal all wounds. He'd been trying to find a permanent solution for Sarah's situation, but legal guardianship laws favored blood relatives, even cruel ones. "Yes, sir," Sarah whispered, though the bruises on her arms told a different story. Preacher Samuel sat beside her on the narrow bench, his presence both comforting and complicated. His kindness made her yearn for safety, but she'd learned that wanting something too much only made losing it hurt worse. "Mrs. Henderson brought by some soup," he said, setting down a covered bowl. She thought. "You might be hungry." Sarah accepted the food gratefully, though her stomach was so tight with constant fear that eating had become difficult. "Thank you. Sarah, I've been thinking about your situation. There might be other options we haven't explored." Hope fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. "What kind of options?" "Well, I've been corresponding with a mission school in Denver. They take in orphaned children, provide education and care. It wouldn't be permanent guardianship, but it would get you away from—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. Away from Silas, away from the bruises and the fear, and the nights when she pressed herself against the vestry wall and listened to his drunken footsteps searching for her. "Would I be able to come back? To visit Mama's grave?" Preacher Samuel's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. "Denver might as well be another world for a girl with no money and no family. We don't have to decide anything right now," he said gently. "But I want you to know that people care about what happens to you." After he left, Sarah pulled out her mother's handkerchief again, studying the delicate stitching in the fading light. Her mother had been working on a larger piece when the fever struck, embroidering pillowcases with morning glories and hummingbirds. Sarah had found the unfinished work in their room, the needle still threaded, waiting for hands that would never return to complete the pattern. She thought about the mountain woman who defended her yesterday, the fierce voice that had cut through Silas's rage like a sword. Most adults looked through Sarah as if she were invisible, but McKenna had seen her, had stepped between her and danger without asking for anything in return. The hard candy the woman had given her that morning sat wrapped in her pocket, too precious to eat. It represented something Sarah had almost forgotten existed: kindness without expectation, protection without price. Outside, evening shadows crept across the church grounds, and somewhere in town, Silas was drinking away his humiliation and planning his revenge. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street when Silas Garrett stumbled out of Murphy's saloon, the broken whiskey bottle still clutched in his meaty fist. 3 hours of drinking had done nothing to wash away the taste of yesterday's humiliation, and every sympathetic look from his drinking companions only stoked the fire burning in his gut. Sarah sat on the church steps where she'd spent most of the day, her thin frame hunched over the primer book she thought no one noticed. The sight of her reading, putting on airs like some fancy Eastern lady, sent fresh rage coursing through Silas's whiskey-soaked brain. "Girl," he bellowed, weaving toward the church. "Get yourself over here. Time you learned some respect." Sarah's head snapped up, terror flooding her dark eyes. She clutched the book against her chest and pressed herself back against the church door, but there was nowhere to run. The street had cleared as townspeople recognized the signs of Silas in a dangerous mood. "Please," Sarah whispered as he reached the church steps. "I haven't done anything wrong. Haven't done anything?" Milas's voice rose to a roar. "You embarrassed me in front of the whole damn town, standing there like some helpless lamb, while that mountain witch made me look the fool." He grabbed Sarah's arm, yanking her to her feet with such force that the primer book flew from her hands and scattered its pages across the church steps. The sight of the scattered words seemed to enrage him further. "Reading books like you're better than everyone else," he snarled, raising the jagged bottle. "Time someone taught you your place." The bottle caught the afternoon light as it arced downward, aimed at Sarah's terrified face. But before it could find its target, a voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "Touch her again, and you'll die." McKenna materialized from the shadows beside Murphy's store, her hunting knife already in her hand. The blade, worn smooth by decades of use, gleamed with deadly purpose. Her grey eyes held the cold promise of violence that made even hardened miners step aside. Silas turned toward her, swaying but not backing down. "This ain't your business, mountain woman. Girl's my blood, and I'll discipline her as I see fit." "Your blood?" Cass stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his shouting. "That child has more strength in her little finger than you have in your entire worthless carcass. You threatening me again?" Silas waved the broken bottle in her direction. "I got rights here. Law's on my side." "Law." Cass spat the word like poison. "The law that lets men like you destroy everything innocent and good. That law?" The confrontation had drawn a crowd. Murphy emerged from his store, drying his hands on his apron. Several miners stopped their conversation to watch. Mrs. Henderson and 2 other church ladies appeared at the corner, their faces tight with worry. Sheriff Williams pushed through the gathering crowd, his hand resting on his gun butt. "That's enough, both of you. Silas, put down that bottle." Cass sheathed the knife. "She drew on me first." Silas protested, though his grip on the bottle remained firm. "Crazy mountain witch thinks she can tell decent folks how to raise their own kin." "Decent?" Cass laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Look at that child, Silas. Look at her arms, her face. See those bruises? That's your handiwork." Sarah remained pressed against the church door, tears streaming down her cheeks, but making no sound. She'd learned that crying only made things worse. "A man's got a right to maintain discipline," Silas insisted, but his voice wavered as he noticed the faces in the crowd. Some showed approval, but others revealed disgust and shame. "Discipline?" Cass took another step forward. "You want to see what real discipline looks like?" The knife moved so fast that Silas barely saw it coming. The bottle exploded in his hand as Cass's blade struck it, sending glass shards spinning through the air. Silas yelped and stumbled backward, blood trickling from a dozen small cuts. "Next time," Cass said quietly, "I won't aim for the bottle." Sheriff Williams stepped between them, his face grim. "That's assault with a deadly weapon, Cass." "That's justice," she replied, but she slid the knife back into its sheath, something this town seems to have forgotten the meaning of. Silas clutched his bleeding hand, his face purple with rage and humiliation. "This ain't over, mountain woman. That girl belongs to me, and I'll have her back over my dead body," Cass said simply. As the crowd began to disperse, Cass knelt beside Sarah and began gathering the scattered pages of her book. "You all right, child?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. No one had ever defended her before. No one had ever made Silas back down. "Can you read these words?" Cass asked, holding up one of the pages. "Yes, ma'am." Something shifted in Cass's expression. "Smart girl. Don't let anyone make you ashamed of that." She handed Sarah the reassembled book and walked away, leaving the girl staring after her with something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. The torn wanted poster fluttered against the church steps like a wounded bird, its edges caught by the evening wind. Sarah noticed it first as she gathered her scattered belongings, the faded ink and weathered paper almost invisible against the wooden planks. But something about the partial image, a woman's face, a name that began with Cass, made her pick it up with trembling fingers. Most of the text was illegible, worn away by weather and time, but the words, "armed and dangerous," remained clearly visible at the bottom. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the stern features, younger but unmistakably those of the woman who had just saved her life. "Child, you need to come with me." Sarah looked up to find Cass standing beside her, the hunting knife now sheathed, but her eyes scanning the dispersing crowd with predatory alertness. The mountain woman's face was set in hard lines, the brief softness from moments before replaced by grim determination. "I can't," Sarah whispered, clutching the primer book and quickly hiding the wanted poster beneath its pages. "Silas will come looking for me. That's exactly why you can't stay here." Cass extended her hand, weathered and scarred but steady. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah took it, feeling calluses earned through years of mountain survival. The contact sent an unexpected warmth through her small frame. When was the last time someone had touched her with gentleness instead of violence? They walked through the town as twilight settled over the mountains, Cass's presence creating a pocket of space around them. Townspeople stepped aside without meeting their eyes, some from respect, others from fear. Sarah noticed how Murphy nodded grimly from his doorway, how Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tighter but didn't look away, how Sheriff Williams watched from the jail porch with troubled eyes. The trail up to Cass's cabin wound through pine forests that grew thicker and more ancient with each step. Sarah had never been this far from town, and the wilderness both thrilled and terrified her. Every shadow could hide a bear or mountain lion. Every rustling branch might signal danger. But Cass moved through it all with the confidence of someone who belonged to this harsh landscape. "How far?" Sarah asked, her legs already aching from the steep climb. "Not much further." "You doing all right?" Sarah nodded, though she was breathing hard in the thin mountain air. She'd grown up in town, where the biggest challenge was avoiding Silas's drunken rages. This world of towering pines and rocky slopes was beautiful but alien. Cass's cabin sat in a clearing overlooking the valley below, its sturdy log walls and stone chimney speaking of careful craftsmanship. Smoke rose from the fireplace, and warm light spilled from the windows, creating the first truly welcoming sight Sarah had seen in weeks. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished but meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth large enough to cook meals and provide warmth through harsh winters. Handmade furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, filled the space efficiently. What struck Sarah most was the absence of personal items, as if the occupant was prepared to leave at a moment's notice. "Sit," Cass said, gesturing toward one of the chairs. "I'll make some coffee. You hungry?" Sarah nodded, suddenly aware that she hadn't eaten since the soup preacher Samuel had brought that morning. Cass moved around the small kitchen area with practiced efficiency, stoking the fire, putting coffee on to brew, slicing bread and cold meat from stores that spoke of careful preparation. "You live here all alone?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 15 years now. Don't you get lonely?" Cass paused in her preparations, her back stiffening slightly. "Loneliness is safer than trust." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning Sarah didn't fully understand. She pulled out her primer book, and the wanted poster fluttered to the floor. Cass noticed immediately, her grey eyes focusing on the torn paper with laser intensity. "Where did you find that?" "By the church steps. After Silas." Sarah's voice trailed off as she saw the change in Cass's expression. Cass picked up the poster, studying it with the careful attention of someone examining a dangerous snake. Her jaw tightened as she read the faded text, memories clearly flooding back like water through a broken dam. "That was a long time ago," she said finally. "Are you really dangerous?" Cass looked at the 12-year-old girl sitting at her table, seeing something of herself in those watchful dark eyes. "To people who hurt children? Yes, very dangerous." She crumpled the poster and threw it into the fire, where it caught quickly and burned to ash. But Sarah had already memorized every visible detail, filing it away with all the other questions about the mysterious woman who had saved her. Outside, darkness settled over the mountains, and somewhere below in Bitter Creek, Silas Garrett nursed his wounded pride and planned his revenge. But for the first time in months, Sarah felt safe enough to close her eyes without fear. The children's primer book lay open on the rough wooden table as dawn light filtered through the cabin windows, its simple stories taking on new meaning in the mountain stillness. Sarah had woken before sunrise, her body still accustomed to the vigilance that had kept her alive these past weeks, and found herself drawn to the familiar comfort of reading. Mary helped her mother bake bread for the church social, she read aloud softly, her finger tracing beneath each word. All the neighbors praised Mary for being such a good helper. "That's fine reading." Cass's voice came from the doorway, where she stood holding 2 cups of coffee. "How long have you known your letters?" "Mama taught me when I was little. She said education was the one thing nobody could steal from you." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. Wrapping her small hands around the warm cup, Cass settled into the chair across from her, studying the girl's face in the morning light. Without the constant fear etched in her features, Sarah looked younger, more like the child she should be allowed to be. Your mama was right about that. What else did she teach you? Numbers, mostly. How to figure sums and make change. She said a woman needed to know about money so men couldn't cheat her. Sarah's voice carried pride mixed with sadness. She knew about medicines, too, which herbs could help with fever and such. She was real smart. Sounds like she was. You want to learn some mountain skills? Sarah's eyes widened with interest. What kind of skills? For the next hour, Cass taught Sarah how to read the forest around the cabin. She showed her which plants were safe to eat and which were poison, how to identify animal tracks in the soft earth, how to tell direction by the moss growing on tree trunks. See this here? Cass pointed to a cluster of small white flowers growing near a fallen log. That's wild garlic. Good for cooking and keeps you healthy too. But this over here, she indicated similar-looking plants a few feet away. That's death camas. One bite would kill you. Sarah knelt beside the plants, studying the subtle differences with the same intensity she brought to her reading. How do you tell them apart? Smell mostly. Wild garlic has that onion scent. Death camas has no smell at all. In the wilderness, your nose can save your life as much as your eyes. They gathered wild herbs and edible roots, Cass patiently explaining each plant's properties and uses. Sarah proved to be a quick learner, her intelligence hungry for practical knowledge that went far beyond the simple moral lessons in her primer book. Why do you live up here all alone? Sarah asked as they walked back toward the cabin, their gathering basket full of morning's harvest. Cass was quiet for so long that Sarah thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully controlled. Sometimes the world down there gets too loud. Too many people wanting things from you, expecting you to be someone you're not. Up here I can just be myself. Don't you miss having someone to talk to? I talk to you now, don't I? Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile Cass had seen from her. It transformed her entire face, revealing the bright, curious child beneath the layer of protective wariness. Back at the cabin, Cass showed Sarah how to prepare the herbs they'd gathered, hanging some to dry and chopping others for immediate use. The work was meditative, requiring attention but not conversation, allowing both of them to exist comfortably in shared silence. Miss Cass? Sarah's voice was hesitant. What's going to happen to me? The question Cass had been dreading hung between them like smoke. She set down her knife and looked directly at the girl, seeing past the bruises to the intelligence and strength that reminded her painfully of another child from long ago. I don't know yet, she said honestly. But I promise you this, as long as you're with me, nobody's going to hurt you. Even if Silas comes up here. Especially if Silas comes up here. Sarah nodded, somehow reassured by Cass's matter-of-fact tone. She picked up her primer book again, but this time she read aloud with purpose, sharing the simple stories as if they were gifts. Tom and Sally walked to school every morning. They always helped each other carry their books and share their lunch. Cass listened to the child's clear voice, reading about friendship and kindness, wondering when she'd last felt such peace. The mountain silence wrapped around them like a blanket, and for the first time in 15 years, her cabin felt less like a hiding place and more like a home, outside. The forest settled into its daily rhythms, and somewhere far below, the town of Bitter Creek began another day of choosing between courage and convenience. The church bell tolled 7 times as the townspeople of Bitter Creek gathered in the small sanctuary, its bronze voice carrying across the valley like a call to judgment. Preacher Samuel stood at the pulpit, his weathered hands gripping the wooden edges as he surveyed the faces before him, faces divided by more than just the center aisle. On the left side sat the supporters of order and tradition, Silas Garrett, with his bandaged hand, flanked by his drinking companions from the mine. Behind them, several business owners who feared disruption to their careful relationships with customers and suppliers. Their expressions carried the weight of men who believed that maintaining the status quo was more important than protecting one orphaned child. On the right side, a smaller but determined group had assembled. Mrs. Henderson and her circle of church ladies occupied the front pew, their faces set with quiet resolve. Murphy sat with his wife, their Irish practicality having long ago taught them to recognize right from wrong, regardless of legal technicalities. Doc Harrison had taken a seat near the back, his medical bag beside him as always, ready to treat whatever wounds might result from this gathering. Sheriff Williams stood at the side of the sanctuary, his position carefully neutral, but his eyes watchful. He'd seen enough frontier justice to know how quickly words could turn to violence when good people felt cornered by bad laws. "Friends," Preacher Samuel began, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years ministering to this community. "We gather tonight to discuss a matter that touches the very soul of our town. The question before us is simple. What is our obligation to protect the innocent among us?" Silas shifted in his seat, his face already flushed with afternoon drinking. "Preacher, with all due respect, ain't no question here. That girl is my legal ward, and I got papers to prove it. Law's the law." "Aye, the law." Murphy stood slowly, his Irish accent thickening with emotion. "And what does the law say about a man who beats a child until she's too afraid to sleep in her own bed? What does it say about bruises on a little girl's arms and terror in her eyes?" "A man's got a right to discipline his own," called out Jake Morrison, one of Silas's mining partners. "Spare the rod, spoil the child. Bible says so right there." Mrs. Henderson rose to her feet, her small frame somehow commanding the attention of the entire room. "The Bible also says, 'Suffer the little children to come unto me,' Mr. Morrison. I've seen that child's bruises. I've watched her flinch when any adult comes near. That's not discipline, that's cruelty." A murmur ran through the congregation, voices mixing approval and dissent. Preacher Samuel raised his hands for quiet, but the tensions in the room had been building for days and wouldn't be easily contained. "The mountain woman had no right," insisted Pete Hawkins, who ran the general store. "Taking that girl up to her cabin like she owns her. What kind of example does that set? Next thing you know, every woman in town will think she can make decisions that belong to men and the law." "Maybe it's time some of us did," said Martha Williams, the sheriff's wife. Her words carried unexpected steel, surprising even her husband. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending that following the letter of the law is the same as doing what's right." Doc Harrison cleared his throat, his medical training giving weight to his words. "I've treated that child twice in the past month, once for bruises that couldn't possibly have come from any accident, and once for what appeared to be a dislocated shoulder. In my professional opinion, leaving her in Silas Garrett's care is tantamount to signing her death warrant." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the sanctuary's oil lamps. Silas lurched to his feet, swaying slightly. "You calling me a murderer, Doc?" "I'm calling you a drunk who doesn't know his own strength when he's angry," Doc Harrison replied evenly. "And I'm saying that child won't survive another month under your roof." "She ain't gonna survive much longer up on that mountain neither," Jake Morrison added. "That McKenna woman's got a past, and it ain't pretty. Word is she's wanted for murder down in Texas." The revelation sent a shock through the congregation. Even those who supported Cass's actions looked troubled by this news. Preacher Samuel's face grew grave as he considered the implications. "Even if that's true," Mrs. Henderson said firmly, "it doesn't change what we've all seen with our own eyes. That woman protected a child when no one else would. She put herself in danger to keep Sarah safe, and now she's taken the girl God knows where," Silas growled. "For all we know, she's planning to sell her to some mining camp or worse. Enough." Preacher Samuel's voice boomed through the sanctuary. "We will not engage in wild speculation about anyone's motives. The question before us is clear. Do we stand by and watch a child suffer, or do we find the courage to protect her regardless of what the law says?" The bell tower creaked in the wind outside, its bronze voice silent now, but its presence a reminder of all the prayers offered and unanswered in this place. The town sat divided, each side certain of their righteousness, while somewhere up in the mountains, a woman and a child waited for a community to decide their fate. Sarah's small fingers trembled as she held the faded photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling. The image showed a younger Cass standing beside a tall man with gentle eyes and a little girl with pigtails who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. They stood in front of a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, their faces bright with the kind of happiness that comes from believing the world is fundamentally good. She'd found it tucked beneath a loose floorboard while helping Cass organize supplies in the cabin's storage area. Now, as afternoon light streamed through the windows, Sarah studied every detail of the photograph, seeing past and present collide in the weathered features of the woman who had become her protector. "You weren't supposed to find that." Cass's voice came from the doorway, quiet but heavy with old pain. She'd returned from checking her trap lines to find Sarah sitting at the table, the photograph cradled in her palms like something precious and fragile. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, starting to put the picture away. "I didn't mean to pry." "No." Cass crossed the room slowly, her boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Maybe it's time someone knew." She sat across from Sarah, her grey eyes fixed on the photograph with an expression that mixed love and agony in equal measure. For long minutes, neither spoke, the silence filled only by the crackle of logs in the fireplace and the distant call of a hawk circling the valley below. "That's my husband Thomas and my daughter Lucy," Cass said finally. "The picture was taken 3 months before they died." Sarah's breath caught. "What happened to them?" Cass reached for the photograph, her fingers tracing the faces with infinite gentleness. "We had a farm outside of Austin. Good land, good neighbors, the kind of life where you believe hard work and decent values are enough to keep your family safe." She paused, gathering strength for words she'd never spoken aloud to another living soul. "There was a man named Wade Brennan who wanted our land, made offers, threatened foreclosure, tried every legal means he could think of. When those didn't work, he decided to try other methods." Sarah remained perfectly still, sensing that interruption might shatter whatever fragile courage was allowing Cass to share this story. Lucy was 8 years old, smart as a whip, could read anything you put in front of her. Thomas used to say she'd be a teacher someday, maybe even go to college back east. Cass's voice grew softer with each word. "She was picking wildflowers in the meadow behind our house when Brennan's men took her. The cabin seemed to grow colder despite the fire burning in the hearth." Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes, understanding now why Cass lived alone on this mountain, why she'd been so fierce in defending a stranger's child. They said they'd return her unharmed if we signed over the deed. Thomas wanted to give them what they wanted, but I knew men like Brennan. I knew that giving in once would never be enough. Cass's hands clenched into fists. "I was right, but being right didn't save my family. Did you get her back?" "We tried. Thomas and I tracked them to an abandoned cabin 20 miles from our farm. We could hear Lucy crying inside, calling for her papa." Cass's voice broke slightly. "Thomas went in the front while I circled around back. I heard the gunshots before I could reach her." Sarah wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I'm so sorry. By the time I got inside, they were both dead. Thomas shot trying to reach her, Lucy killed because she'd seen their faces." Cass's grey eyes met Sarah's, and in them the girl saw pain that had been carefully contained but never healed. "I killed 3 men that night. Would have killed more if I could have found them." "Is that why you had to leave Texas?" Law didn't much care about the why of it. 3 dead men made me a wanted woman, regardless of what they'd done to my family. Cass gently took the photograph from Sarah's hands. "I came here to disappear, to find some place where the past couldn't follow me." Sarah studied Cass's face, seeing new understanding in the lines around her eyes, the careful way she held herself apart from the world. "But you didn't disappear. You saved me. Maybe. Or maybe you saved me." Cass tucked the photograph into her shirt pocket, close to her heart. "Lucy would have been about your age now if she'd lived. She'd have been proud to know a girl as brave and smart as you. Will you tell me more about her sometime?" For the first time since Sarah had known her, Cass smiled without reservation. "I'd like that. I'd like that very much." Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of pine and approaching winter, but inside the cabin, two wounded souls had found something neither had dared hope for again. The healing power of shared truth and mutual understanding. The threatening note fluttered against the cabin door like a wounded bat, its crude handwriting barely legible in the morning light. Sarah found it first when she stepped outside to gather firewood. The paper pinned to the rough wood with a rusty nail that had been driven deep enough to crack the timber. "We know where you are," the message read in block letters that looked like they'd been carved rather than written. "Give up the girl or face the consequences." Sarah's hands shook as she pulled the note free, the nail leaving a dark wound in the door's surface. She'd been living with Cass for nearly a week now, long enough to begin believing that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where fear couldn't reach her. The note shattered that illusion like glass against stone. "Cass," she called, her voice tight with panic. The mountain woman emerged from the cabin already alert, her hunting knife in her hand and her grey eyes scanning the tree line for signs of intruders. When she saw the note, her expression hardened into something that would have frightened Sarah if it hadn't been directed at their enemies. "How long has this been here?" Cass asked, examining the paper with the attention of someone trained to read threats. "I don't know. I just found it when I came out for wood." Cass studied the crude handwriting, noting the way certain letters were formed, the spacing between words. This wasn't written by Silas. Man can barely write his own name when he's sober. Then who? Someone who knows how to make threats that sound official. Cass crumpled the note and shoved it into her pocket. "Someone who wants us to think we're dealing with the law instead of vigilantes." The implication sent fear crawling up Sarah's spine like ice water. She'd hoped that distance and isolation might protect them, but apparently nowhere was far enough from Silas's reach. "What do? We prepare." Cass's voice carried the calm certainty of someone who'd faced down threats before. "Come inside. There are things you need to learn." For the next hour, Cass taught Sarah skills no 12-year-old should need to know. She showed her how to load and fire the old shotgun that hung above the fireplace, how to bar the door from the inside, how to escape through the back window if the front entrance was compromised. "If men come here and I'm not around, you don't try to be brave," Cass instructed firmly. "You run. Follow the deer trail behind the cabin until you reach Bitter Creek. Then find Sheriff Williams or Doc Harrison. Tell them what happened. What if they don't believe me? They'll believe you. Both of them have seen enough of Silas's work to know the truth when they hear it." Sarah nodded, trying to memorize every detail of Cass's instructions while fighting back the tears that threatened to overwhelm her. Just when she'd begun to feel safe, the world was proving once again that safety was an illusion for girls like her. "Miss Cass, are you going to send me away?" The question hung between them like smoke from the fireplace. Cass stopped her preparations and looked directly at Sarah, seeing the terror barely held in check behind the girl's brave facade. "Is that what you want?" "No, I want to stay with you forever." "But I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Cass knelt beside Sarah's chair, her weathered hands gentle on the girl's shoulders. "Listen to me carefully. I've been alone on this mountain for 15 years, and in all that time, I've never had anything worth protecting. You've given me something to fight for again, but the note said they know where we are. It didn't say they know who they're dealing with." Cass's smile held no warmth, only the promise of violence directed at anyone who threatened her makeshift family. "Let them come. They'll learn the difference between a frightened woman and a dangerous one." Despite her fear, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. She'd never had anyone willing to fight for her before, never experienced the fierce protection that came from being truly valued by another human being. "Will you teach me to shoot properly?" "Yes, and to track and to hide and to survive." Whatever happens, Sarah, you're going to be strong enough to take care of yourself. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountain peaks, and somewhere below in Bitter Creek, men planned violence against a woman and child whose only crime was refusing to accept cruelty as inevitable. But in the cabin, surrounded by the scent of pine logs and the warmth of the fire, two people who'd found each other against all odds, prepared to defend what mattered most, the right to protect the innocent, no matter the cost. The quilt square arrived wrapped in brown paper, slipped under Murphy's door in the pre-dawn darkness like a secret message between conspirators. When Murphy's wife Mary found it that morning, her fingers traced the careful stitching with recognition and growing hope. The pattern was unmistakable, a variation of the Underground Railroad's North Star design that her grandmother had taught her as a child. Martha Williams had sewn it, Mary was certain. The neat, precise stitches and choice of blue calico fabric matched the work Martha had contributed to church quilts for years. But this wasn't meant for any church social. This was a signal, a way for the women of Bitter Creek to communicate their support without openly defying their husbands or the law. By noon, Mary had quietly visited 6 houses, showing the quilt square only to women she trusted. Each understood immediately. Within hours, a network of silent cooperation began forming, invisible to the men who spent their days arguing about law and order while ignoring the moral crisis unfolding in their midst. Mrs. Henderson was the first to act. She appeared at Murphy's store just before closing time, her marketing basket heavy with extra supplies. "I need to return this flower," she announced loudly enough for other customers to hear. "It's gone weevilly already," Murphy nodded solemnly, playing his part in the charade. He took the flour sack, knowing full well it contained preserved meat, dried beans, and warm wool stockings sized for a 12-year-old girl. "I'll make sure you get a fresh sack, Mrs. Henderson. Can't have customers dealing with spoiled goods." Sarah Patterson, the seamstress, contributed a heavy winter coat that had been ordered but never claimed. "Customer changed her mind," she explained to Murphy. "Shame to let good work go to waste." Even Martha Williams defied her husband's official neutrality, arriving with a covered basket that supposedly contained day-old bread for Murphy's livestock. Inside, Sheriff Williams's spare ammunition and a hand-drawn map of mountain trails lay hidden beneath carefully arranged cornbread. "Tom's trying to do right by everyone," Martha confided to Mary Murphy in hushed tones. "But sometimes doing right means bending the rules a little." The network operated with the efficiency that comes from years of church committees and community organizing. Messages passed through seemingly innocent conversations about recipes and weather. Supply drops were disguised as routine errands and social visits. Within days, a steady stream of resources began flowing toward the mountain cabin where Cass and Sarah waited. Doc Harrison provided the medical supplies, claiming they were expired medications that needed disposal. "Can't let old medicine go to the patients," he told Murphy with a straight face. "Might do more harm than good." His bag contained fresh bandages, laudanum for pain, and herbal remedies that could treat everything from fever to infected wounds. He also included a small bottle of carbolic acid and detailed written instructions for treating gunshot wounds. Knowing that the mountain woman might soon need such knowledge, Preacher Samuel contributed differently. Appearing at Murphy's with a worn Bible and an apologetic expression, "I'm afraid this copy has some pages missing," he said, opening the book to reveal hollowed-out pages containing $20 in silver coins. "Can't give damaged goods to parishioners. The money would buy ammunition and other supplies that couldn't be donated directly. Resources that might mean the difference between survival and surrender when Silas and his allies finally made their move." Mary Murphy coordinated the effort with the skill of a general organizing supplies for a siege. She kept careful mental notes of what had been contributed and what was still needed, ensuring nothing was duplicated and no family gave more than they could afford. "How do we get these things to them?" asked Mrs. Henderson during one of their carefully casual meetings at the general store. "Leave that to me," Mary replied. "Patrick knows those mountain trails better than most. He used to hunt up there before McKenna made it her territory." Murphy himself seemed unaware of his wife's activities, though his careful ignorance suggested he understood more than he let on. When Mary mentioned needing to visit her sister's grave in the mountain cemetery, he simply nodded and prepared a pack mule for the journey. "Take your time," he said, helping her load supplies that were supposedly for grave tending. Mountain trails can be treacherous this time of year. The quilt square remained displayed in their kitchen window, its pattern catching the afternoon light like a beacon. Other women noticed it during their visits, understanding that solidarity sometimes required secrecy, that protecting the innocent might demand defying the powerful. As evening settled over Bitter Creek, the network of women settled into their routines of ordinary domesticity, their rebellion hidden behind flour-dusted aprons and Sunday smiles. But in each heart burned the knowledge that courage could be contagious, and that sometimes the most powerful resistance came from those. Society expected to remain silent and compliant. The legal documents rustled in the mountain wind as County Attorney Bradford Hutchins spread them across Sheriff Williams's desk, their official seals and elaborate script designed to intimidate rather than inform. Williams studied the papers with growing unease, recognizing immediately that something wasn't quite right. About their pristine condition and suspiciously perfect timing, these documents establish beyond question that Silas Garrett has full legal guardianship of the minor child, Sarah Whitmore, Hutchins announced, his city clothes and soft hands marking him as an outsider in the rough frontier town. Any person preventing his exercise of that guardianship is guilty of kidnapping under territorial law. Sheriff Williams picked up the custody papers, noting the heavy parchment and official-looking stamps. Everything appeared legitimate at first glance, but his years of law enforcement had taught him to look beyond surface appearances. "These are dated 3 weeks ago," Williams observed. "Seems convenient that they arrived just now, when the girl's been missing for over a week. Legal proceedings take time, Sheriff. The territorial courts don't operate on frontier schedules." Williams examined the signature lines more carefully, his suspicion growing as he noticed subtle inconsistencies in the handwriting. The judge's signature looked practiced, but the witness signatures showed the hesitant strokes of someone copying rather than signing naturally. "I'll need to verify these with the territorial capital," Williams said slowly. "You'll act on them immediately," Hutchins snapped, his professional veneer slipping to reveal the arrogance beneath. "Every hour that child remains with that wanted criminal endangers her life and violates territorial law." The mention of Cassie's wanted status sent a chill through Williams. If Hutchins knew about the Texas warrants, the situation had become far more complicated than a simple custody dispute. "What exactly do you know about Cassandra McKenna?" Hutchins smiled with the satisfaction of a man holding winning cards. "I know she's wanted for 3 counts of murder in Austin County, Texas. I know there's a $500 bounty on her head, and I know that harboring a known fugitive makes you an accessory to her crimes." Williams felt the trap closing around him. Whether the custody papers were genuine or not, Cassie's criminal past gave Hutchins legal leverage that would be difficult to counter. The law, as always, favored those with the resources to manipulate it. "Suppose I wanted to contest these documents. What would that process look like?" "It would take months, possibly years. Meanwhile, that poor child remains in the custody of a dangerous criminal who's already demonstrated her willingness to use violence." Hutchins leaned forward, his voice taking on a tone of false reasonableness. "Sheriff, we both know you're a good man trying to do right by everyone, but the law is clear here. You have 48 hours to produce the child, or I'll be forced to request federal marshals to handle the situation." The threat hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Federal involvement would mean the end of local control. the imposition of outside authority that cared nothing for the nuances of frontier justice. Williams had seen what happened when territorial politics collided with local communities. Innocent people got hurt, while lawyers and politicians protected their own interests. After Hutchins left, Williams sat alone in his office, staring at the suspicious document. Doc Harrison found him there an hour later, slumped in his chair like a man facing an impossible choice. "Tom, you look like you've seen a ghost." Williams explained the situation, watching Doc Harrison's face grow increasingly grim as the implications became clear. "Those papers are forgeries," Doc said immediately. "I knew Sarah's mother. Elizabeth never mentioned having a brother, and she would have." Woman was desperate near the end, looking for any family that might help with the girl. "Can you prove it?" "Not in a way that would matter to a territorial court." Elizabeth was private about her past, careful not to share details that might follow her west. Doc Harrison sat heavily in the chair across from Williams's desk. "What happens if Cass refuses to give up the girl?" Then Hutchins brings in federal marshals, and this whole situation becomes a bloodbath. Cass McKenna didn't survive 15 years as a fugitive by surrendering peacefully. And if she does surrender, then Sarah goes back to Silas, the beating continue, and eventually we'll be investigating a child's death instead of trying to prevent one. The two men sat in silence, each understanding that every choice led to tragedy. Outside, the town of Bitter Creek continued its daily routines, unaware that the fate of one orphaned girl had become entangled with federal law, territorial politics, and the kind of corruption that turned justice into a commodity sold to the highest bidder. The legal documents lay spread across Williams's desk, like a poker hand dealt by a cheating dealer, their false authority backed by real power that could destroy lives with the stroke of a pen. The old rifle hung above the fireplace like a relic from another age, its wooden stock worn smooth by decades of careful handling. Cass lifted it down with reverent hands, feeling the familiar weight that had once belonged to her father and before him, his father. The weapon had protected 3 generations of her family, and now it would serve once more in defense of innocence against those who would destroy it. Sarah watched from the kitchen table, her small hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. 2 days had passed since Sheriff Williams's reluctant visit to warn them about the federal marshals. 2 days of preparation that felt both too long and not nearly long enough. "That's a big gun," Sarah observed, her voice carefully steady despite the fear Cass could see in her dark eyes. "Big enough for the job." Cass checked the rifle's action, the mechanism operating with the smooth precision of quality craftsmanship. "My daddy carried this through the war with Mexico. Said it never failed him when he needed it most." She began the methodical process of cleaning and oiling the weapon, her movements automatic after years of proper maintenance. The ritual was as much about mental preparation as mechanical readiness, a way of focusing her mind on what needed to be done. "Miss Cass, what happens if the marshals come?" Cass paused in her work, considering how much truth a 12-year-old could bear. "If they come, we'll deal with them the same way we've dealt with everything else, together. But what if there are too many? What if they have more gun? Then we'll have to be smarter than they are." Cass resumed cleaning the rifle, her voice taking on the tone of a teacher explaining a difficult lesson. "Numbers and guns don't always win fights, Sarah. Sometimes what matters most is knowing what you're fighting for." Through the cabin window, she could see the mountain trails that led down to Bitter Creek, the paths that had provided both escape and isolation for 15 years. Soon those same trails might carry armed men bent on destruction, men who served a corrupt system that valued legal documents over human decency. "I've been thinking about what Sheriff Williams said." Sarah spoke quietly. "About how they want to take me back to Silas because of some papers. What about it? What if I went with them? What if I didn't fight it?" Sarah's voice grew smaller with each word. "Maybe then they'd leave you alone." Cass set down the rifle and moved to the table, kneeling beside Sarah's chair. She took the girl's hands in her own, feeling how cold they'd become despite the warmth from the fireplace. "Sarah, look at me." She waited until the girl met her eyes. Do you remember what I told you about my daughter Lucy? Yes, ma'am. I let someone take her because I thought cooperation would keep her safe. I thought following the rules would protect my family. Cassie's voice carried the weight of old regret. That choice cost me everything I loved. I won't make the same mistake twice. But you could get hurt because of me, and you could die because of them. Which risk do you think I can live with? Sarah's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for days. I don't want anyone to get hurt. Neither do I. But sometimes good people have to fight to protect what matters. That's not our choice. That's forced on us by people who think might makes right. Cass returned to the rifle, loading it with practiced efficiency. Each cartridge slid into the chamber with a soft click, the sound somehow both ominous and reassuring. Will you teach me to shoot it? You're not big enough to handle this rifle properly, but I can teach you to use the shotgun effectively. Cass gestured toward the shorter weapon propped beside the door. Close range, easier to aim, the sound alone might make someone think twice. For the rest of the afternoon they practiced. Sarah learned to brace the shotgun stock against her shoulder, to sight down the barrel, to squeeze rather than pull the trigger. Her small frame struggled with the weapon's recoil, but she persisted with the determination of someone fighting for her life. As evening approached, Cass prepared their position with military precision. She moved furniture to create defensive angles, positioned ammunition within easy reach, and planned escape routes through the cabin's back window. Every detail mattered when facing overwhelming odds. Miss Cass, Sarah's voice came from where she sat practicing with the unloaded shotgun. Do you think we'll win? Cass considered the question seriously. I think we'll make them pay a price they weren't expecting. Sometimes that's enough to change someone's mind about whether a fight is worth it. Outside, darkness settled over the mountain, and somewhere below, men planned violence against a woman and child whose only crime was refusing to accept that cruelty was inevitable. Sarah's mother's wedding ring caught the morning light like a tiny beacon as Sarah turned it over in her palm, studying the simple band of gold that had once symbolized love and hope. She'd kept it hidden since her mother's death, sewn into the lining of her thin coat where Silas couldn't find it, and sell it for drinking money. Now, as the sound of approaching horses echoed through the mountain valley, Sarah slipped the ring onto her finger where it hung loose, but somehow felt exactly right. If today was to be her last day of freedom, she wanted to carry something of her mother's love with her into whatever came next. They're coming, Cass said from her position by the window, the old rifle steady in her hands. 6 riders, maybe 7. Silas is with them, and at least 2 who look like federal marshals. Sarah joined her at the window, peering through the gap in the curtains at the line of men making their way up the mountain trail. Even at this distance, she could see the authority in their bearing, the confidence of men who believed law and numbers were on their side. Miss Cass, I'm scared. So am I, Cass admitted, her honesty somehow more comforting than false reassurance would have been. But being scared doesn't mean we stop fighting. Sometimes it means we fight hard. The riders reached the clearing in front of the cabin and arranged themselves in a semicircle, their horses stamping and snorting in the thin mountain air. Silas sat his mount with the satisfaction of a man about to reclaim what he considered his property, while the federal marshals flanked him with professional alertness. Cassandra McKenna, the lead marshal's voice carried easily across the clearing. You're under arrest for kidnapping and harboring a fugitive. Send out the girl and surrender yourself peacefully. Cass moved to the door, but remained inside, her rifle trained on the marshal's chest. The girl stays with me, Marsh. She's safer here than with that drunk who's been beating her since her mother died. The law says different. Silas Garrett has legal custody, and you've got no right to interfere with that. Legal custody. Cass's voice carried 15 years of bitter experience with corrupt officials. Based on what? Forged papers, bought with blood money. Marshal Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He'd seen the documents that gave Silas custody rights, but something about the whole situation had felt wrong from the beginning. Still, orders were orders, and wanted fugitives didn't get to decide which laws they'd follow. Miss McKenna, I've got a warrant for your arrest signed by a federal judge. The girl comes with us, and you come in chains. That's how this ends." No, Sarah's voice carried clearly from inside the cabin, surprising everyone, including herself. "That's not how this ends." She stepped into the doorway beside Cass, her small frame dwarfed by the mountain woman's protective presence, but her voice steady with newfound courage. "My name is Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, and Silas Garrett is not my uncle. He's a liar who convinced my dying mother he was family so he could get his hands on what little money we had." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Several of the men with Silas exchanged uncomfortable glances, while the marshals looked between the girl and their supposed legal documents. "Girl's been brainwashed," Silas called out, but his voice lacked conviction. Mountain Witch filled her head with lies. "Then explain this." Sarah held up her mother's wedding ring, its gold surface catching the light like truth made visible. "This was my mother's wedding ring. It has an inscription inside that says, 'Forever yours, Michael.' My father's name was Michael Whitmore, not Garrett." Marshal Thompson leaned forward in his saddle, his professional instincts finally overriding his orders. "Let me see that ring, girl." "No," Silas's shout cracked across the clearing. "She's lying. Girl's a natural-born liar, just like her whore mother." The words were barely out of his mouth when Cass's rifle roared, the bullet shattering a tree branch inches from Silas's head. His horse reared, nearly dumping him from the saddle. "Next one goes through your heart," Cass promised, her voice deadly calm. "That's assault on a federal officer." Marshal Thompson drew his pistol, but hesitated when he realized his line of fire would endanger the child. "That's justice," Cass replied. "Something you've forgotten the meaning of." In the tense silence that followed, the mountain wind carried the scent of pine and gunpowder, while 7 armed men faced a woman and child who had decided that some things were worth dying for. The real birth certificate arrived in Sheriff Williams's hands, like salvation wrapped in official parchment, its authentic seals and aged paper telling a story that would shatter Silas Garrett's carefully constructed lies. Doc Harrison had ridden hard through the night to the territorial capital, calling in 20 years of professional favors to obtain the document that would expose the truth. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore Williams read aloud to the assembled crowd in the cabin clearing. "Born April 15, 1868, to Michael James Whitmore and Elizabeth Rose Whitmore, née Patterson." No mention of any Garrett family connection. Marshal Thompson studied the document with growing anger, realizing he'd been manipulated into serving corrupt interests. The birth certificate bore the authentic markings of territorial record-keeping, complete with witness signatures and official stamps that matched his knowledge of proper documentation. Furthermore, Doc Harrison continued, producing a second set of papers. "I've obtained copies of Elizabeth Whitmore's medical records from Denver General Hospital. She specifically stated that she had no living relatives when asked about emergency contacts during her treatment." Silas's face had gone pale beneath his whiskers, the confident swagger of moments before replaced by the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. "That don't prove nothing. Girl could have been lying to the doctors." "Then explain this," Williams said, unfolding a third document. "Marriage certificate for Michael Whitmore and Elizabeth Patterson, dated June 3rd. Witnesses include Patterson family members, all of whom verify that Elizabeth was an only child. The evidence mounted like stones in a wall, each document another proof of Silas's deception." Marshal Thompson's jaw tightened as he realized the extent to which he'd been used by corrupt officials willing to sacrifice a child's safety for unknown political gains. "Marshal," Cass called from the cabin doorway, her rifle still trained on the group, but her voice carrying less hostility. "Seems to me you've got a choice to make. You can continue serving men who forge legal documents and traffic in children, or you can do what's right." Thompson holstered his weapon slowly, his professional pride warring with his growing disgust at being manipulated. "Miss Garrett, it appears these custody documents are fraudulent. I'm placing you under arrest for presenting false evidence to federal officers." "Now wait just a minute." Silas's protest cracked with panic. "I got rights here. It can't just—" "You have the right to remain silent," Thompson interrupted, dismounting from his horse. I suggest you exercise it before you make this situation worse for yourself." But Silas, drunk on desperation and liquid courage, made the fatal mistake of reaching for the pistol at his hip. The movement was clumsy, telegraphed by his alcohol-impaired reflexes, but it represented a threat that McKenna couldn't ignore. Her rifle spoke once, the bullet taking Silas through the shoulder and spinning him off his horse like a rag doll. He hit the ground hard, screaming and clutching his wounded arm while his weapon spun away into the underbrush. "Should have listened to the marshal," Cass observed, working the rifle's action to chamber another round. The remaining men with Silas, miners and drifters who'd been promised easy money for what they thought would be simple intimidation, suddenly found their enthusiasm for the fight evaporating, faced with a woman who shot to wound rather than kill. Demonstrating both mercy and precision, they began to reconsider their involvement. "Anyone else want to discuss Sarah's custody arrangements?" Cass asked mildly. The silence stretched across the clearing like morning mist, broken only by Silas's groaning and the nervous whickering of horses. Marshal Thompson approached the wounded man with professional detachment, checking his injury before applying field bandages. "He'll live," Thompson announced, "but he's going to need proper medical attention." Doc Harrison emerged from behind the trees where he'd taken cover during the shooting, his medical bag already in hand. "I can treat the wound, but he needs to get to town for proper care." As Doc worked on Silas's injury, Marshal Thompson approached the cabin where Cass and Sarah still stood together. His expression had changed from official authority to something approaching respect. "Miss McKenna, I owe you an apology. I should have investigated those documents more thoroughly before riding up here." "You were doing your job as you understood it," Cass replied. "Can't fault a man for that. What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice small but steady. Thompson looked at the real birth certificate, then at the frightened girl who'd shown more courage than most adults. "Now we straighten out the legal mess and make sure you're placed with people who'll actually take care of you." In the mountain silence that followed, justice finally began to emerge from the wreckage of corruption and lies. The hand-sewn dress lay spread across Cass's kitchen table like a promise of better days, its blue calico fabric dotted with tiny yellow flowers that caught the afternoon light. Miss Henderson had worked on it in Nisset for 3 days, taking Sarah's measurements from memory and adding careful touches that spoke of feminine care and attention. Sarah touched the fabric with wonder, her fingers tracing the neat stitching and delicate collar that transformed simple cloth into something beautiful. She'd never owned a dress made specifically for her, had spent most of her life wearing her mother's altered clothing or the rough hand-me-downs that came with charity. "It's beautiful," she whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might make the gift disappear like a dream. "Try it on," Cass encouraged, her own voice thick with emotion she didn't quite understand. Seeing Sarah's joy over something as simple as a new dress awakened feelings she'd buried since Lucy's death, maternal instincts that had been dormant for 15 years. The dress fit perfectly, its full skirt swirling around Sarah's thin legs and its fitted bodice giving her the silhouette of a young lady rather than a frightened child. Miss Henderson had even included a matching hair ribbon, a small luxury that made Sarah feel precious in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. "Do I look different?" Sarah asked, studying her reflection in the cabin's small mirror. "You look like yourself," Cass replied. "Just dressed the way you deserve to be dressed." The legal arrangements had been surprisingly straightforward once the truth emerged. With Silas in custody and the forged documents exposed, territorial authorities had been eager to distance themselves from the corrupt scheme. Sarah's case had been transferred to a family court judge in Denver, a woman known for her protection of children's interests. "Judge Morrison wants to meet with both of us next week," Cass explained, setting down the official letter that had arrived that morning. "She'll make the final decision about your guardianship." Sarah's joy over the dress faded slightly as uncertainty crept back into her expression. "What if she doesn't think you're suitable? What if she wants to send me to an orphanage or that mission school? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Judge Morrison has a reputation for listening to children's preferences. Your voice will matter in this decision." The past week had brought a parade of visitors to the mountain cabin, townspeople who had finally found the courage to openly support what Cass and Sarah represented. Murphy had climbed the trail with supplies and quiet words of encouragement. Preacher Samuel had offered his testimony about Sarah's character and Silas's cruelty. Even Sheriff Williams had made the journey, bringing official statements that would support Cass's petition for guardianship. "There's something else we need to discuss," Cass said, her tone becoming more serious. "The judge will want to know about my past, about the charges from Texas." Sarah had been dreading this conversation. "Will they send you back there?" "Possible. Federal marshals are still investigating, trying to determine if the statute of limitations has expired or if there are grounds for clemency." Cass sat across from Sarah, her weathered hands folded on the table. "I want you to understand that fighting for you might cost me my freedom. Then maybe we should run. We could go to California or Oregon, somewhere they'd never find us, and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. That's no way to live, Sarah. You deserve better than a life on the run." Sarah smoothed the skirt of her new dress, thinking about all the ways her life had changed since that first terrible day when Cass had stepped between her and Silas's violence. The mountain woman had given her safety, education, and something even more precious, the knowledge that someone valued her enough to fight for her. "If they take you away, I want you to know something," Sarah said quietly. "You saved me, not just from Silas, but from believing that I didn't matter to anyone." Cass reached across the table to take Sarah's hand, feeling the strength that had grown in the girl over these past weeks. "You saved me too, child. You reminded me that some things are worth the risk." Outside, the mountain afternoon settled into evening, painting the cabin in golden light that made everything seem possible. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, bound by the kind of love that chooses itself rather than accepting what blood or law dictates. The new dress symbolized more than just clothing. It represented Sarah's transformation from victim to valued person, from abandoned child to daughter of the heart. It spoke of a community's investment in her future and a woman's commitment to nurturing rather than merely protecting. As evening shadows lengthened across the clearing, two people who had found each other against all odds, prepared to defend their chosen family before the final arbiters of law and justice. The garden seeds lay scattered across the kitchen table like promises of spring, their brown and black shells holding the potential for life that would outlast any single season. Cass had ordered them from a catalog that arrived weekly, with Murphy supply deliveries, choosing varieties that would thrive in mountain soil and provide both beauty and sustenance. "Tomatoes, beans, carrots, and marigolds," Sarah read from the seed packets, her voice filled with wonder. "Are we really going to plant all of these?" "If Judge Morrison grants the guardianship, yes. A garden is an investment in the future, Sarah. It means we're planning to stay here together." The legal proceedings in Denver had concluded 3 days earlier with a verdict that surprised no one who truly knew the facts. Judge Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, had listened carefully to testimony from both sides before declaring that Sarah's best interests clearly lay with the woman who had risked everything to protect her. The Texas charges against Cass had been dropped after intensive investigation revealed the circumstances of her family's murder and her subsequent actions. The federal prosecutor had quietly acknowledged that no jury would convict a woman for killing the men who had murdered her husband and child, regardless of what the letter of the law might say. "Miss Cass, what made you decide to plant a garden now?" Cass looked up from the seed packet she'd been organizing by planting season. 15 years I've lived on this mountain without putting down real roots. Grew what I needed to survive, nothing more. But a child needs to see things grow, needs to understand that caring for something brings rewards that last. She selected the packet of marigold seeds, holding it up to the afternoon light streaming through the cabin windows. "These were your mother's favorite flowers, according to Mrs. Henderson. Seems fitting to plant them in your garden." "My garden? Our garden. We'll plan it together, work it together, harvest it together. That's how families do things." The word families settled between them with the weight of official recognition. Judge Morrison's ruling had made legal what their hearts had already determined, that sometimes the strongest bonds are forged by choice rather than blood. that love can grow in the most unlikely circumstance. I've never planted anything before, Sarah admitted, turning the bean seeds over in her palm. What if I do it wrong? Then we'll learn together. Gardening isn't about perfection, it's about patience and hope, and the willingness to try again when things don't work out the first time. Cass spread out a piece of paper and began sketching a rough layout of the area behind the cabin, where they would break ground in the spring. We'll start small this year, maybe expand as we learn what grows best in this particular spot. Sarah watched the garden take shape under Cass's pencil, neat rows for vegetables, a corner reserved for herbs, borders of flowers that would attract beneficial insects and provide beauty throughout the growing season. It looked like more than just a garden. It looked like hope made visible. Will you teach me to preserve what we grow, like you do with the wild foods you gather? Of course. Canning, drying, root cellaring, all the skills a mountain woman needs to feed her family through the winter. Cass paused in her sketching. Your mother would have wanted you to know these things. The mention of her mother brought the familiar ache to Sarah's chest, but it was gentler now, softened by the knowledge that Elizabeth Whitmore's love lived on in the care Cass provided. Her mother's dream of education and opportunity had found fulfillment in ways she never could have imagined. Miss Cass, do you think we'll still be here when I grow up? I think we'll be wherever we choose to be. That's the gift of family, Sarah, having someone who'll stick with you wherever life leads. Outside, the mountain winter was slowly loosening its grip on the high country. Snow still covered the peaks, but the afternoon sun carried the promise of longer days and warming soil. By the time the last frost passed, they would be ready to plant seeds that would grow into food, flowers, and the kind of abundance that comes from tending something with love. The packets of seeds represented more than just future vegetables and flowers. They symbolized the decision to build rather than simply survive, to create beauty in addition to meeting basic needs, to invest in a future that included both of them, working side by side in the mountain soil. As evening approached, Cass and Sarah began planning not just their garden, but their life together. A life rooted in the earth and seasons, growing in the kind of love that chooses to nurture rather than possess, to protect rather than control. The new wooden cross stood straight and proud in the mountain soil, its fresh-cut pine releasing the clean scent of living wood into the crisp morning air. Cass had carved it herself during the long winter evenings, her weathered hands shaping each detail with the care of someone rediscovering faith after years of doubt. Sarah knelt beside the simple grave marker, arranging the wildflowers they'd gathered on their morning walk. 1 year had passed since that terrible day when Silas Garrett had raised his hand to strike her. 1 year since McKenna had stepped from the shadows to change both their lives forever. I brought your favorite stories, Sarah said softly, opening the primer book that had somehow survived all their trials. Miss Cass has been teaching me new ones too, but I thought you might like to hear the familiar ones. She read aloud in the mountain silence, her voice carrying stories of friendship and kindness across the small cemetery where the people of Bitter Creek laid their loved ones to rest. The townspeople had insisted that Elizabeth Whitmore deserved a proper headstone, pooling their resources to provide one that honored a woman who had loved her daughter enough to trust a stranger with her future. Cass stood at a respectful distance, watching Sarah tend to her mother's memory with the grace that came from understanding that love persists beyond death. The girl had grown in the past year, not just physically but in confidence and strength that spoke of a child who knew herself to be valued and protected. The mountain community had changed too. What began as one woman's refusal to tolerate cruelty had sparked a broader awakening about responsibility and justice. Sheriff Williams had implemented new procedures for investigating domestic complaints. Preacher Samuel's sermons had taken on themes of protecting the vulnerable that resonated far beyond Sunday morning. The women's network that had supported Cass and Sarah had evolved into a formal organization dedicated to helping families in crisis. She would be proud of who you've become, Cass said as Sarah finished her reading and closed the book. Do you think she knows about us? I think mothers always know when their children are loved and safe. That knowledge travels beyond any distance or barrier. They walked back toward town together, taking the path that led past Murphy's store and the church, where Sarah had once slept in fearful hiding. The same streets that had once seemed hostile now welcomed them, as established members of the community, their unlikely family having earned respect through courage and persistence. At Murphy's store, they found a small celebration in progress. Doc Harrison was showing off photographs of his new grandchild, born healthy to his daughter in California. Mrs. Henderson displayed a letter from her nephew announcing his engagement to a school teacher in Oregon. The small joys of life continued, made sweeter perhaps by the knowledge that their community was capable of protecting such happiness when it was threatened. "Miss McKenna, Miss Sarah!" Murphy called out from behind his counter. "Perfect timing. Package arrived for you on yesterday's supply wagon." The box bore the return address of a seed company in St. Louis, its contents representing the next phase of their mountain garden. Inside, they found not just the varieties they'd ordered, but several packets of flowers they hadn't requested, a gift from the company after reading about their story in a territorial newspaper. "Morning glories," Sarah read from one packet, "for fences and trellises, blooms from summer through first frost. Your mama would have loved those," Mrs. Henderson observed, joining them at the counter. She always said climbing flowers reminded her that beautiful things could grow in the most unlikely places. The afternoon passed in the comfortable rhythms of small-town life, with conversations about weather and gardens, updates on neighbors' health, and plans for the spring planting season. Sarah participated in these discussions with the confidence of someone who belonged, whose opinions mattered, whose future was secure. As evening approached and they climbed the familiar trail toward home, Cass reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in their lives, but in her understanding of what was possible. The wooden cross she'd carved for Elizabeth Whitmore's grave had been an act of faith. Faith that love could triumph over cruelty, that courage could overcome fear, that two wounded souls could heal each other through the simple act of choosing to care. The cross stood as a monument to all they'd survived and all they'd built together, a symbol of hope restored and faith renewed in the fundamental goodness that persists even in the darkest times. The journal pages rustled softly in the evening breeze as Sarah carefully wrote the final words of their story, her penmanship neat and deliberate, despite the emotion that threatened to make her hands shake. 2 years had passed since that first terrible confrontation, 2 years of growth and healing that had transformed both their lives and their understanding of what family could mean. "And so," she wrote, "Miss Cass taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite being afraid. She showed me that love doesn't always come from blood relatives, but sometimes from strangers who choose to care when no one else will." The journal had been Sarah's idea, a way to preserve the lessons they'd learned for other children who might someday find themselves in similar circumstances. Preacher Samuel planned to send copies to mission schools and orphanages throughout the territory, hoping their story might inspire other adults to recognize their responsibility to protect the vulnerable. Cass sat on the cabin porch, watching the sun set over the valley below, while listening to the scratch of Sarah's pen on paper. At 43, the mountain woman had finally found peace with her past and hope for her future. The lines of grief that had marked her face for 15 years had softened into something approaching contentment. "What are you writing about now?" Cass asked, settling into the chair beside Sarah's small writing table. "About the town's celebration last month, how everyone came together to honor what we accomplished." Sarah looked up from her journal, her 14-year-old face bright with the confidence that came from knowing she was loved and valued. "I want people to understand that protecting children isn't just one person's job, it's something the whole community has to do." The celebration had indeed been remarkable. The town of Bitter Creek had declared an official Courage Day to commemorate their story and recognize others who had shown similar bravery in protecting the innocent. Sheriff Williams had presented Cass with a special badge, naming her an honorary deputy, while Sarah received a scholarship fund contributed by families throughout the territory. "You've grown into quite a writer," Cass observed, reading over Sarah's shoulder. "Your mother would be proud of the young woman you've become. She'd be proud of both of us. We kept her promise." "What promise was that?" to be strong, to use our minds, to choose courage when it matters most. Sarah set down her pen and stretched fingers cramped from hours of writing. Miss Cass, do you ever regret it, stepping in that day, changing your quiet life? Cass considered the question seriously, as she did all of Sarah's thoughtful inquiries. I regret that it took me 15 years to remember who I was meant to be. I regret all the years I spent hiding instead of helping, but regret stepping in to protect you? Never. The garden they'd planted together flourished in the evening light, rows of vegetables and flowers that spoke of permanence and hope. Sarah had proven to have a natural gift for growing things, her patient attention and gentle care coaxing abundance from the mountain soil. Their home had become a stopping place for travelers who often left with full bellies and stories of the woman and girl who'd changed an entire community's understanding of courage. The journal's almost finished, Sarah announced, flipping through pages covered with her careful handwriting. One more chapter about what we've learned, and then it's ready to share. What's the most important lesson you want people to remember? Sarah thought for a moment, her gaze traveling across the peaceful valley where other families were settling in for the evening. That protecting the innocent isn't about being fearless, it's about loving something more than you fear the consequences. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away when someone needs help. As darkness settled over the mountains, mother and daughter by choice sat together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the life they'd built through courage and maintained through love. The journal lay open between them, its pages recording not just their story, but a testament to the truth that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they decided that protecting the vulnerable was more important than protecting themselves. Their story had become part of the mountain's memory now, carried on the wind and in the hearts of everyone who understood that courage was contagious, that love could triumph over cruelty, and that sometimes saving someone else was the best way to save yourself. The final words Sarah had written glowed softly in the lamplight. Love wins, not always easily, not always quickly, but always eventually. Love wins.